They come up with this idea, for instance, that there are indigenous people who were moved out. The Palestinians are indigenous people, and they were moved out by the Jews. You can do that if you want. Now let's do Britain. You want to play the indigenous people own the land first game and the other people should fuck off? I do not want to live in a country with Hamas supporters. I want them deported. I want them chucked out. Simple. If there are people in the UK who are offended by the posters of missing Jewish children, they must leave.
Hey Veracity, welcome back to the channel. It's your girl Veramo, and I'm back with another reaction video. Today I'm going to be reacting to trigonometry, right? This is my first time reacting to them, and this is Douglas Murray. This is about survival. Let's go, guys.
Douglas, you're back for the, I don't know which time, but we've had you on many times. And I put it to you that there's good news and bad news. The good news is that you were right. The bad news is that you were right. What have you made of the last 3 weeks?
Well, I suppose like all of us, it's a mixture of things. First shock, then horror, then shock again, then horror, then disappointment, and then rage, probably, in roughly that order. Horror at what happened in Israel, shock like everyone this was able to happen, horror at the details of what happened, shock then at the response on the streets of cities like the one we're sitting in London, the fact that there were so many people who didn't even give it a day before they turned out on the streets of my city, supporting the people who'd done this act of terror. And then in the weeks since, increasing rage. Rage that I have to share a country with these people.
And I think the thing that we've all had to come to terms with is how some people have just been so open about supporting an extremist Islamist terrorist group and also refusing to acknowledge it as such.
Well, before you answer, Douglas, one of the things that I've noticed in comments is people like, well, these are pro-Palestine marches. And I think we have to be clear that what we're talking about is in the first 2 days prior to Israel responding in any way, there were people celebrating.
Yeah, the bodies of the dead hadn't even been found. They were still warm in some cases. Some people were still in the process of being massacred. And even as that was still going on, people were already out on the streets of cities like London, protesting against Israel. And that was what it was. It was straight away a protest against Israel. And, you know, look, there are lots of fine delineations you can do about it, some of which are true and some are not. You could claim that the people who've come out in recent weekends on the Saturdays care about Palestinian lives. I don't think they do. I just don't think they do. And I'll tell you one reason why, is that nobody in the Middle East, apart from the Israelis, cares about the Palestinians a jot. I've traveled around the region. I've spoken to enough people, including leaders of other countries in the region, to know the Jordanians do not like the Palestinians at all. They find them an unbelievable encumbrance, and that's why they haven't opened their borders to the people in the West Bank who should effectively be in Jordan. The Egyptians loathe the Palestinians. The authorities are keeping the border between Egypt and Gaza closed because they hate the Palestinians. I know people who were born in Gaza when Gaza was owned by Egypt. If Egypt wanted to solve the Gaza problem, it could do so tomorrow by taking control of Gaza or allowing the people of Gaza to go into Egypt, where they should be. Nobody else in the region cares. The Qataris host Hamas and fund Hamas, as well as, of course, pumping billions of pounds into countries like this one to make us deeply compromised. But nobody in the region cares about the Palestinians. Certainly nobody cares about them more than the Israelis, who go to incredible efforts to try to limit the deaths and the mistreatment of the Palestinians, even as the whole region, the world, has given them these people to look after. Nobody really cares about the Palestinians, and frankly, the idea that Muslims care about their brother Muslims is absolute rubbish. I think we've flattered much of the so-called Muslim street by even pretending this in recent years. hundreds of thousands of Muslims have been killed in Yemen in the last few years, and there hasn't been a protest 1% of the size of what we've seen in recent days and weeks in the West. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims have been killed in Syria in the last over a decade, since the civil war in Syria, by Assad, by the Assad regime, by rival jihadist groups, by intra-religious sects, and much more. And we haven't seen 1% of the people who turned out on the streets this day. The idea that Muslims actually care about their fellow Muslims is insane. They don't. What they care about is Jews. There is something at the very root of Islam and followers of the Muslim religion who cannot bear any war in which Israel is fighting, and most of all loathes any war in which Israel is winning. And you can see it. It's at the absolute core of their being. This is why they are on the streets of this city and others marching. It's not because they love fellow Muslims, it's because they hate Jews.
So you're saying there's something at the root of the religion. Well, let's tease that apart. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's two particular things worth mentioning. One is, of course, that Muhammad, the founder of Islam, himself beheaded, massacred many, many Jews. Famously, there's one battle in particular, and the Banu Quraysh. It's a story you can find in the Quran and the Hadith, and of course, this is because the Jews would not accept the revelation of Muhammad, such as it was. And so they were seen within Islamic tradition as being one of the first people who turned down the opportunity to join Islam. And as a result, of course, Muhammad decapitated hundreds and hundreds of Jews. So that's not a good start. But there's a bigger thing, I think, within the Muslim world, which is worth mentioning, which the late Bernard Lewis pointed out on a number of occasions, which is the great problem within Islam when it comes to not just Judaism, but the wider non-Islamic world is that the Muslim religion claims to be the last revelation from God to man, which, as we all know, is a very large claim to make. It says there have been previous revelations, but this is the last and final one. And what's more, God has given you a book, the Quran. And the Quran is the one book you need. The opening here is the book wherein is no doubt, which is quite a bold claim as well, I'd say. But the claim at the foundation of Islam is, here is the book wherein is no doubt, and it's the only book you need. And it's the final word from God that man will ever have. Now, if you are the recipients of this book, the people who end up either converting or being forced to convert to Islam, and eventually the areas that Islam takes over by force, if you are somebody who's brought up in that tradition, you would think that being the recipient of the final revelation from God, you would be in a just tip-top situation. You would imagine that, well, this is going very well. We've got the final revelation from God. What's not to like? What's not on our side? And then several things happen in the millennia since, which is, first of all, many, many Muslims realize that despite having the final revelation from God, things don't seem to be going very well. Until oil is discovered in certain parts of the Middle East, most people live in total destitution. The discoveries and enlightenments of Europe largely pass the Muslim world by. This shouldn't be exaggerated. Certain parts of the Muslim world, of course, give the Western world certain parts of what becomes the Western European tradition. So there were times of interplay. There were times of mutual learning. And now, of course, everyone looks back at them, or many people look back at those times with nostalgia. Nevertheless, in the main, the Muslim world cut itself off from the rest of the world and didn't care to learn from the rest of the world, didn't improve the economic conditions of its people, totally failed to create societies anything like as successful as, for instance, European societies. And therein a question arises, which is, if we are the recipients of the final revelation, why is everything so awful where we live? And then you have the additional thing, which is, and how come the Jews return or re-establish of course, many Jews are already living in the area that's now Israel, but already lived there, but many others come from other parts of the world, including from the Middle Eastern countries where they're chucked out by the governments in 48 and so on. The Muslim world sees this tiny, tiny bit of land This tiny bit of land, which, among other things, is the only bit of the Middle East that doesn't have any oil. And they make of it a much more successful country than any of the countries around. Now, if you create a Palestinian state, you just have another failed Arab state, another failed Muslim state to add to the more than 50 already failed Muslim and Arab states. What is the explanation that the Jews who refused the Prophet's invitation to Islam are still here, have this tiny bit of land, and make all of these discoveries and other things that show themselves to be so successful? It's some kind of stab in the heart. And instead of saying, we're doing this wrong, the thing is, the Jews are doing something right, and that must mean that they've rigged the game. That's why they care, among other things. And it leads to the deep pathology of anti-Semitism, which has been largely eradicated in Europe among Europeans, not entirely, but largely. There are still some bits of the far right you can find across Europe, and occasionally in the UK with a sort of the whiff of this noxious thing still emerges. On the left, of course, it's much closer to the boat. But principally anti-Semitism in our own day, of the kind that we hoped had ended with Hitler, exists and indeed thrives in the Muslim world. And the Muslim world is now in our world in Europe, and so we have the Hitlerian horrors of anti-Semitism back.
Well, I have no doubt you're right, Douglas, but one of the things that I think all of us have been struck by in recent weeks is that the pro-Palestine cause, let's put it in that language as they do, is very popular among young people. In fact, I'm sure you've seen the polls which show that young people believe the Hamas attack was genocidal and believe it was justified on the basis of what Israel...
They are pro-genocide.
It seems to be. And not all of those people are young Muslims in this country. Some of them are not. How did that happen?
Fantastic ignorance. I mean, does anyone around this table, or anyone watching, honestly think that we have a generation that is well educated?
Touche.
I mean, find me the teacher or find me the professor at any university that in the last 50 years who would say to you, every year the undergraduates come up, the students come up, and they just know more and more each year. Maybe in certain sciences you could say in a particular field. You couldn't say it about the humanities at all. You couldn't say it in most fields. Certainly people don't come up every year knowing more and more history. The reason why the young people you talked about believe this is because they have been fed a form of indoctrination, and a particular version of history, which effectively, as you both know, maps on a very specific and perverted version of American racial history and maps it onto absolutely everything in the rest of the world. Add to that a particular form of anti-colonial history, post-colonial history, whatever you want to call it, which knows nothing of colonialism, but knows only about the post-colonial world. And you also see that that is mapped onto the Middle East. So these people who talk about Israel and probably couldn't point to it on a map, they certainly don't know which river they mean when they chant from the river to the sea. They couldn't find that on a map, that's for sure.
From the river to the sea, of course I've chanted it. Do I think that all Israelis should be pushed out of the country, or Jews, or should be treated like this? No.
Do you know which river and sea they're talking about, by the way?
I don't know the name. The river, I know the Mediterranean, it would be the sea, but no, I wouldn't know the river, no.
Okay, that's
it, yeah.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
These people talk in what terms? They basically fall into two groups. They talk in terms of occupation, colonizers, apartheid. And this is the Americanized racial justice version of this mapped onto the Middle East. That the Israelis are colonizers, for instance, and that they're indigenous peoples, and that the Palestinians are indigenous peoples, despite there being Jews in the land many years before anyone even came up with the term Palestinian, which is a disputed term anyway. So they come up with this idea, for instance, that there are indigenous people who were moved out. The Palestinians are indigenous people, and they were moved out by the Jews, the Israelis, the Zionists. And this version is, of course, a replay of that version of American history, which is there with the Edenic first populations of America, the indigenous peoples, and then people from Europe came, the wicked Spanish and Italians and Portuguese and the French and even the British come and do their thing. And so they just put this version of history onto the Middle East. To those people, I would say, fine, you can do that if you want. Now let's do Britain. Want to play that game? You sure? You better not get the British started. But that's
Tell me
one
more,
version.
Douglas. What do you mean?
You want
Oh my god, this video is super long. It's about 56 minutes long. That's almost an hour. One thing I love about Douglas is the fact that he always spits facts. He's never afraid or ashamed to stand for the truth. Douglas always stands for the truth. Extending tolerance to people who do not extend it back to us must be stopped. And that is true. You extend tolerance to these immigrants, to the Islamists, yet they don't tolerate us. If you go to an Islamic country, their laws are so strict, you can hardly survive. You can hardly breathe. You can hardly survive in the Islamic countries because of their strict laws. They don't even like immigrants in their countries, yet they are the ones immigrating to other countries. Why don't they just stay in their country? Why are they going to other countries? Why don't you just stay in your country and, live your life over there? Douglas Murray is a treasure. In fact, that man must be protected. I know so many Muslim people are going to come for him. He must be protected by all means. He speaks truth and he speaks it clearly with so much power and confidence. He knows what he is saying. I know before that he's straightforward and he always hits the nail on the head. He has said it all. This old Douglas Murray thing is about survival. The Islamists, they shouldn't be here. These immigrants, they shouldn't be in our country. They themselves, they don't accept us in their own country. Why are they in our country? What are they doing? They are making things more difficult because we ourselves in our country, we are facing hardship. We are going through hard times. There's no employment. There's inflation. Then you guys are coming over. Like, you guys are adding more to our problems. And yet, they are even trying to impose their laws on us. Why? How? Make it make sense. It doesn't make no sense.